Dragonage Inquisition is the most tedious RPG I've ever played. It feels like an MMO. Personally, I feel like the main quest was okayish. It's surprisingly short, padded out by level requirement and war table BS. And here, and did I mention war table BS? No meaningful side quest. It always like find a corpse with notes on it and follow the breadcrumbs to a chest with a disappointing loot. Nothing is as interesting as the side quest in pretty much any other RPG. Maps are too large for its own good. Bigger is not better if there is no substance to it. Horrible combat system with constantly respawning enemies, which are not difficult at all, just have more bloated health. Very little tactics involved compared to Origins. No payoff for upgrading your keep, liberating camps, gaining forts, mines, and logging camps. I was expecting Mass Effect 2 style endgame battle where your upgrades would drastically change the outcome and determine who lives and who dies. At no point are your companions are in any danger of living or dying if they disagree with you. Romance are also boring. In Origins, you can romance half of your camp and even have gangbang if you like. In Dragon Age 2, the friendship rivalry and the romance and hate meter being separate made some of the most realistic romances in the games. You could tell your partner to piss off and still have a fun functioning relationship. I like it, but it is definitely my least favorite. Like there are some positive elements in Inquisition, but it fills with lots of fillers. For example, none of the Ferelden really matters in the grand scheme of things, and part that did would be better off set in Orlais. Orlais itself feels a lot more shallowly developed when compared to Ferelden in Origins or Kirkwall in Dragon Age 2. Corypheus is also kind of a weak villain when he should have been one of the best. He gets one he gets one big moment where he is hyped as fuck in Haven, only to spend the rest of the game suffering losses after losses. Then Trespasser reveal that he is basically a filler until Soles can put on the villain hat. I wouldn't mind as much, but he is one of the original Magisters that caused the Darkspawn. He is one of the original Darkspawns. He should have been a pseudo blight with Darkspawns at his command. In practice, he is just a powerful mage. I also felt down regarding that many crises that was hyped up leading up to this game. The Mage and Templar War, the Orlesian Civil War, the Elf Rebellion, all happening all at once. While the Fade leak into the world is a cool idea that should have been improved upon in this game. Instead, all those come to a halt before the prologue even starts. It's really disappointing. Then there's the fact that BioWare chose not to include any cool payoff of the past choices, like Anders, the architect, because they might die. This is more of an issue of how BioWare have chosen to handle the world states more than it is Inquisition specifically, though. It's just that Inquisition is where it starts to really sting because because it was an appropriate time to bring some of those choices back, like have some consequences. I am enjoying the game, but there are some things that are bugging me throughout. First things first, while the story and the world building and the main quest is enjoyable, much of the side quests I experienced are fetch quests. I think this type of quest can be called upon radiant quest, in Skyrim, like randomly generated computer generated quests. Dragonage 2 have some of that as well. Even Origins have, but it is mostly relegated to like the notice table, and they don't harm the overall game, in my opinion, that much. But in Inquisition, you have to gain level points in order to advance through the main quest. So you are absolutely forced to do some of the terrible side quests in this game. The gameplay is smooth, but the combat is mostly boring, and tactic system sucks compared to the previous two games. It's like BioWare couldn't commit to making either a tactical based RPG or a fully fledged action. The combat animation are far better balanced in Origins and 2 though. I am liking the companions so far. Sure, they have all an instantly characteristic personalities as is the companions in Origins did, but they aren't terrible either. I do think that the overall tone of the game is more humorless than the previous games. Sure, there is some comic relief, but characters like Liliana and Varric just seems less cheery, whimsical, and full of life as they did in previous entries. The actual ending is the DLC, however, because the main story quest of the base game is feels fully incomplete. Like the third act is so underwhelming that I don't think anyone should play this game without its DLC. The war table seems cool on paper, but it is just boring. It doesn't seem to have an actual strategy game or anything like that, but instead just an odd way to push the player into go and complete a bunch of bland side quests. Fetch these, collect 50 pieces of whatever resources on that location before you can advance more interesting into a more interesting side quest. All in all, I still think Dragon Age Origins is the best game overall. I loved hell I even loved Dragon Age 2 in its own way, and I expected to enjoy the Inquisition as well. However, I was disappointed that where they taken the overall story post Origins. So much of this world state feels forced. I've been playing the Dragon Age series for the first time in the past few years and loved Origins. Sure, it has aged a bit in terms of graphics, but the story is amazing and the gameplay was slow but tactical. The characters were memorable and there is so many interesting ways to roleplay the warden. The ending was very satisfying, honestly in a way that no sequel was ever needed. I feel like the game was never intended to have a sequel. Like BioWare was completely originally intended to make this a one-off game, like a standalone title. They didn't expected Origins to be so much of a success that they forced two sequels out of it. But Inquisition was just boring. The open world is the worst I've ever seen in a game, just filled with boring MMO-esque fetch quests with literally no stories, no choices, not to mention the world zones are just empty and too big, with barely any connection to the main story. It was just so tedious to do some shitty quest or close the same old rifts just to further the main story. The story itself feels like a poor man's origins. The but Origin had so many different arcs that made it more interesting, and the Blight and Loghain were a serious threat. Corypheus, meanwhile, is one of the most pathetic villain I've ever seen. The Inquisitor just owned him throughout the entire game and is way overpowered with his enemies and is way overpowered with his armies, capable advisors. The only time there was any tension in the game was in Haven, and even that doesn't matter. since you get a new fancy castle immediately after that. In general, any dark fantasy elements of the first two games were removed, and the story felt sanitized. The Inquisitor itself sucked as a protagonist. If you have a voiced main character, at least make it memorable, like Shepherd or Hawk. Instead, the character Inquisitor itself was so bland and neutral. The voice actor didn't even try and sound always the same. You can pick different races again, but without origin stories, they lack impact. Overall, I think in terms of BioWare games, only the last two games like Andromeda and Anthem are worse than Inquisition, or maybe Jade Empire. I think Inquisition is one of the most disappointing shallow open world RPGs I've ever played, and I hope the next game improves upon it because I think most of its flaws are genuinely tied to the Frostbite engine. So I hope they have enough experience with Frostbite engine to improve upon the game's foundational flaws.